رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا رسول الله. صلى الله عليك يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. يا غريب يا مظلوم كربلاء، طبتم وطابت الأرض التي فيها دفنتم، فيا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. صلوات. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على أفضل الأنبياء والمرسلين بعد الخلائق أجمعين، سيدنا وسندنا وشفيعنا مولانا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين اصطفاهم الله أجمعين. أما بعد، فقال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق وهو أصدق الصادقين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألا بذكر الله تطمئن القلوب. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. My respected Sayyid, brothers and sisters, I bid you all assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I assert the name of Allah Azza wa Jalla, the omniscient, the omnipotent. All praise is due to Allah for giving us this ability to exist and to interact with our existence by being gregarious human beings who by nature are inquisitive about the life that we live. And by nature we ask a lot of questions. If you see a very child who's from the ages of 3, maybe up until the ages of 8, 9 and 10, they're always asking constant questions. Because the way that we are is that we've been made as beings who ask depending on what we see, and we are completely inquisitive of what's surrounding us. And the strength of our understanding and our reality and our ideology comes from the openness of the message that we receive. Yesterday we spoke about the religion of Islam being the religion which is the fastest in order to get to the message of the truth. It's the fastest to get to the message of growth. And a young brother came to me today and asked me, he said, what makes Islam grow so much? What makes it grow so fast? Which is a great question. And in all reality, the strength of the message is based on how you take it and interpret it. The same Islam which we have today was at one point used by certain individuals within history to justify the killings of innocent human beings. It was used to justify the killing of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. It was used to justify the Kaaba. It was used to justify the burning down of the Kaaba. It was used to justify so many heinous and treacherous crimes. And the reality is, from common observation, is that the strength of the message is only as open-minded as you are to the message itself. Meaning, as much as the message is powerful, if you are a closed-minded individual, you can only do so much. Let me give you a brief example. Look at, for example, today you have a character like Zakir Naik. Zakir Naik, according to the modern understanding of brains and genius and smarts, is extremely, when it comes to computation and numbers and memorization, the man is a whiz. But when it comes to actual openness to what religion is meant to be and religious freedom and autonomy, and to allowing other people to interpret the Quran based on the proper discussions, he is completely limited to his capacity, and hence the Quran which he has, which he interprets, is useless and limited. And in the modern world today, if Jibreel came down to him and gave him the Quran, if the Messenger of Allah Muhammad came to him and gave him the Quran would not be worth much more than his closed mind. And the Quran to you and I is simply a book which is, depending on how open that I am as an individual, the Quran can then take me from there. The Quran cannot take me and make me an open individual when I am closed-minded. That the strength of the Quran, the power of the message lies within the human being and the movement that he takes forward. That's why you see certain individuals who come from zero backgrounds, from zero education. The minute they understand what the Quran is, they are completely moved and they change their lifestyle. And we're going to discuss some of these individuals. And mind you, today there are individuals who have 5 PhDs, but they still worship stone and clay. There are individuals like that today in today's society. Which tells you what? That as much as burhan and dalil and evidence you bring a person, if the individual is closed, then you'll find there's no advancement. Mind you, there are some human beings who are within the Christian and Jewish faith who are so open that they've superseded any closed-minded Muslim today. Because there's an openness to an ideology. When you as a human being become open, you see the fruits of the labor. Now the Quran makes much more sense. Now the Quran's movement is a completely different movement. It's not a closed book, but an open ideology. Salawat ala Muhammad wa alihi. And we alluded yesterday, I'd like to wrap up the conclusion for the 3 nights that I've been here. We concluded yesterday and said that there are some of us who are so stuck in a system of haram and halal, of good and evil, that we have lost touch with our modern reality. We've become so confined within a system of do's and don'ts that we've forgotten the message of reality, which is to live as a human being and progress in life. And we've become stagnant thinkers because our haram and our halal is so fed to us, it's spoon-fed to us. And we are not understanding what it's meant to be. Now, a system of good and evil exists in every society. Some ask the question and say, what is the purpose of evil? If God is such a good God, if He is such a great, magnificent creator, then what's the purpose of evil existing? And in all reality, the haram which we see in our lives, it's what's meant to bring us closer to good and not make us more paranoid the way we've become. The modern Muslim is a paranoid human being. Is a human being who is scared of the simplest ideas, who is so fed up with human movement that every single move that a human in front of him might do, he will label as haram and halal. Let me kind of explain what I mean. You see, the concept of evil exists within a realm, with our realm. It is actually the absence of good. It cannot be measured the way good can be measured, but it's the absence of good. And it's interesting to note that evil is a necessary component to our existence. If it was removed, then the whole human movement as we know it would cease to exist and advance. Let me give a brief example. A lot of us here have taken a multiple choice test, for example. A test whereby you've got a question and you've given different multiple choices. And these choices that we get are made in such a way whereby I look at them and I identify that three are evil and 1 is good, per se. 3 answers are wrong, there's 1 right answer, and I must choose the right answer from A, B, C, and D. When I look at this question and I examine it, the very idea that there are evil answers, quote unquote, or good answers, I have the possibility of doing evil or choosing the wrong answer, gives value to me choosing the right answer. For if my teacher came to me and said, here's your examination, there are no wrong answers, there are only correct answers, no matter what you do, you're going to pass this exam, I would look at my teacher and say, well, you've devalued me. I have much more value than to mock my intelligence and to tell me that here's an all-good test. Because now what's the point? You and I thrive on this idea that after I study and study for an exam, after I go through all the hardship, finally when I do come out with something good, when I do grow, I feel a great sense of rejoice. And that sense of rejoice is given to us only when we're able to supersede the evil, when we're able to leave the evil and go towards the good. And we beg the question, a lot of the times we ask this question, we say, well, why do things like tsunamis happen? Or why do things like tornadoes happen? Why do my close ones die? Why does a child in Africa starve? Why does a child in Detroit get shot? Why does a child in Chicago get hit? For example, why and why and why? And if we look at specific cases, no person should go through this struggle. But from a very holistic experience, it's safe to say that you and I beg the very question of evil. A person might say, for example, I'd like to remove as much evil as possible in my life. But that same person will graduate high school, and when you ask him what kind of degree would you like to get, he'll tell you, well, I'm trying to get the best degree. I want to go through as much hardship as possible. I am willing to go through medical school, through law school, just in order for me to get that great job. Because that challenge and that struggle is what I'm capable of. If you look at the same person and say to him, well, you've got a 4.0 in high school, why don't you go to a 2-month course and finish your degree? The same person will say, no, I've got so much more potential than what you've given me. The struggle is where I succeed. The struggle is what I have an enjoyment in. Hence Allah, the Quran says, Ya ayyuhal insan, innaka kadihun ila rabbika kathan famulaqih. You're going to struggle and struggle and struggle towards your Lord until you one day find Him. That the idea here is we beg the question. We try to remove so much evil, but by nature we love the challenge. We love the challenge. Now let's look at another example. When I was at Wayne State University, there was a debate between the philosophy professor, Bruce Russell's, and by a group of students. And I was with those students. And he made an argument and said, well, how can God allow evil to exist? And he gave a specific example. If there is a young child being drilled by a dentist without any Novocaine being given to the child, or without any anesthetics given to the child, is it safe for the father to know that he can intercede to help his son feel less pain, but he chooses not to intercede? And the example that he gives is God has the ability to intercede in our system and to change the evil that exists, but He chooses not to. How does that work? And the answer is quite interesting, because the system of Allah Azza wa Jal gives us the ability to progress and grow, while the atheistic system does not let human beings grow. Let me give an example. Let's take a hypothetical scenario and say that at one point there are 2 human beings who are fighting, and one human picks up a sledgehammer and decides to hit the other human being. And there is a bystander, a person watching. The typical argument is that God should now intercede and make sure that the person who's going to commit the act is not going to commit the act. And what that does is there are specific scenarios we can work with. Meaning God can say the person would like to hit, and God will take the hammer away. The person can then use his hands, he can then hit with another object, God can keep removing the object, but the human's will to hurt is still there. You're not fixing the problem. Another hypothetical situation is that can say, well, you're now deciding to hit another person, I'm going to change the way you think so that you don't hurt individuals. Now what that does is it limits human capacity. Because the very idea of growth within our lives is based on the concept of decision making and having the ability to do evil and good. Free will is what makes us grow. If God strips our free will and we can no longer commit evil acts, then there's no more room for growth in a human being's life, making us useless as individuals. The mistakes that we made earlier on in the world of science allowed us to grow to the period we are in today. The mistakes which happened early times in the religion of Islam allowed us to become where we are today. The mistakes that a young child makes, that a husband makes, that a wife makes, that a father and a mother make early in their lives, allows them to become the individuals who they are tomorrow. So when we do say, and it's interesting because a lot of the times we point the finger at God and we're so demanding. It's as if we're saying, God, there's so much evil in front of me, why don't you come down and help me? And God is saying, well, what are you doing about it? How are you interacting with your society to make a change? And that's really what it boils down to. Because we can blame God for everything. But at the end of the day, there's got to be a modern movement where you and I now take steps to make a change. Now, to note this, it's interesting to say that we are so bound within the system of good and evil that we've really forgotten what's meant to be with our lives. And when I say system good of evil, It's mostly the system of jurisprudence that we might have. Because a lot of the times, instead of being modern thinkers, we've become robotic individuals, robotic human beings, which take a look at things from a very one-sided angle. And I'm going to give you a brief example. The Messenger of Allah was once standing with one of his companions. And the companion comes to him and said, Ya Rasulullah, I drink alcohol and I'm not willing to stop. I can't give it up. And Rasulullah, being that individual that he was, realized that human mistake, it's what's meant to be cherished to help individuals grow. Human reality is meant to be moved forward through the mistakes that we make and allowing us to grow through those mistakes. So he looks at him, he says to him, you can't give up alcohol. He says, no. He says to him, what can you give up? He says, Ya Rasulullah, I can give up something else. I can give up, for example, gambling. He says to him, give up gambling and drink alcohol. Slowly, slowly, you'll leave alcohol as well. There was a realistic approach to human beings and the mistakes that they made. That Rasulullah didn't come to them and say, this is good, this is bad. If you don't leave this now, you're going to burn in hell. No, he used their strengths. He put his hand in the depths of hell to remove them and take them up. Now, where am I going with this? If you look at the world today in a very holistic approach, you'll find that the most successful human beings are those individuals who are not focused on the haram and the halal, but they're focused on a much greater goal. Islam has got a deep reality, and what a reality! That we've overridden and blurred this reality by a system of laws of haram and halal. Haram exists and halal exists, but different than the way you and I have understood it. So the way you and I have understood it is as if we are young children and God is saying to us, if you do this, I will beat you, I will hit you, I will strike you. Now that can work with the child up until the age of 10 and 15. But when your child becomes 20 or 25, telling him that God's going to burn you in hell is not really going to do much. Or looking at your child and telling him, that's why Imam Ali alayhi salam comes with a profound hadith. He says, speak to your children in the time and the language that they understand. Why does he say this? He says, there are some tactics which are just outdated, which you just cannot use. When your son is 5 or 10 or 12, the haram and halal might work. But when he grows older, he might have to understand the reality differently. Let me give you an example. There's a brother who once comes up to me and says, you know, throughout my high school year, I avoided adultery as much as I could. He was a very young, good-looking young man. And he says, you know, I avoided adultery as much as I could. And I said to him, what made you avoid it? What made you avoid zina? He says, every morning when my father would drop me off to school, he'd say to me, that son, if you committed adultery, God's punishment to us is that we would be very poor. He would make us very poor. And he says, I never wanted to be poor. I always wanted my video games, I wanted my car, I wanted my house, I wanted the luxurious life that I lived, and I never wanted to be poor. He says, so I always stayed away from adultery because I was scared. He says, then when I grow older and I realize that, my God, adultery has got such significance that when I go to a city like Chicago or Detroit and I see the amount of teen pregnancies and the destruction that it causes, it's really an issue. He said, no longer was my focus on the money that I was going to lose if I committed adultery, but now there's something much greater at stake, which is the human growth factor. That if people do commit adultery, and if adultery is continuously committed, that raises the rates of illegitimate children. The more illegitimate children that we have, the less quality of raising the child that exists, and there's an issue with that in our society. He says, now my focus was not the money that my father was promising me, but now my focus was that regardless if it was haram or halal, even if I had no religion, I would still think adultery is bad. Because it's a reality. It is bad because it is bad. It's not bad because God told me it's bad. It's bad because it has consequences. That's why it's bad. Now the question that we ask ourselves is this, and it's a very deeply rooted question, is that the things that I see as haram and halal, if I was not a Muslim, would I still refrain from them? If I wasn't a Muslim, if my mother and father never told me halal and haram, would I still refrain from the thing which I refrain from now? Because that's what the question boils down to. And what this does is it now alleviates us. Now we don't feel pressure as a society, but we're now alleviated. Let me give a brief example. You see, when it comes to the world of coming towards religion, when the Messenger of Allah first came to the people, as we had mentioned in the first night, that his movement was not a movement of halal and haram, but it was a movement of compassion. It was a movement of inspiration. You had individuals who were so inspired by the Prophet. One example of this individual is Amer ibn Jamuh. Amer ibn Jamuh was an older man who was about in his 70s, who was blind. And his sons would come to him at home, and he was completely rebellious against the Messenger of Allah. His sons would come to him and say, "Father, today we heard some of the most powerful lines of poetry." He said, "Then what are the lines?" They said to him, "Today the Messenger recited," and he started reciting, "Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa Iyyaka nasta'een, Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim, غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين." And Amr ibn Jamuh inside his heart would feel some sort of palpitation that there's some sort of truth to these statements and words, but he'd still reject the system that existed there. And he was completely with his idols. So what Amr would do is he would go in front of his idol Manat, and he'd sit in front of Manat. And before there was a system where what they do is they would take, there would be an oracle, a female, which would sit behind the statue. And you would talk to Manat. And when you left, with whatever desire you had, that oracle would speak to you when you came back, and she would give you the answer. Of course, she was just a human being coming up with her own solutions, but this is what they believed. They were godly inspired. So Manat would come in front of, Amr would come in front of Manat and say, "You know, Manat, I've got a real issue here. You know, you're my God, I love you a lot, you know, we've got a great connection here. But there's this Muhammad, and what he's giving me, it just sounds great. There's something in my heart which is telling me, you know, what he's saying is right." This is a 75-year-old man. Now he'd do it in the whispers of his room so his sons don't hear him, because he didn't want them to come to the religion of Islam. What his sons did is the same night, they took the statue, because he wasn't sure what he should do. They took the statue, they wrapped it to a dead dog, and they threw it inside of an empty well which was used for human feces. Amr woke up in the morning thinking, "Where's the statue?" He couldn't find it. He took one of his sons and he asked him, "Where is the statue?" His son looks at him and says, "Father, I found the statue. It's inside this well in this area." And Amr realized that this statue is tied to a dead dog inside of an empty well with human feces. If it can't even help itself, then how can it help me in any way? This is the same man who was against the Messenger of Allah. In the next battle, he begs Rasulullah to come to battle. He says to him, "Oh Rasulullah, I beg you, let me fight with you." He's 75, he dies in the Battle of Badr. It's interesting to note here and to say that the inspiration which the Messenger used was quite interesting. There's something within the world theories today of motivation known as this three circles. I'd like to kind of delve deeper into this. What the three circles state is that the human being lives and is bound within three circles in his existence. The first circle is known as the circle of the what. The second circle is known as the circle of the how. And the deeper, most inner circle is known as the circle of the why. The why is the deepest motivation, the levels of emotional understanding, of logical understanding of why a human being gives a specific act or does a specific act. The second motivation is the how, it's the mechanism and the process. The third largest circle is known as the circle of the what. What laws are we now interpreting in order for us to fulfill our motivation? Sadly to say that within the Muslim community today, our focus has been very little on the actual why of why we actually do things, and has been more set on the what. What are the rules that we must follow? Give me rules and let me follow them, but I have no idea why I'm following them. That's become the movement today. In Dearborn, Michigan, we've got there's our youth centers which are run, and I typically take part, and there are young children who would walk around with the sword of Imam Ali around their necks. And a lot of the times I'd pick at them and ask them why they wear that necklace, just to see what they believe in. What kind of beliefs they have. And you'd be surprised and shocked to see that many of the children which are there have got absolutely no idea what is the meaning behind even wearing the necklace of Imam Ali, what kind of symbolism it has. Some will say to you, well, I saw other people wearing it and I'm not wearing it. Or it's an Imam Ali necklace. Great, but what does Imam Ali mean to you? What does the necklace do for you? Are you now remembering Imam Ali proactively through wearing this necklace? Is it doing something for you? And what we've done now is we focus so much on the actual law of things, don't do this and don't do that, that we've forgotten the deepest, most inner circle of why we are doing what we are doing. We've missed that point. By the way, even companies today market to us this way. Many of us in here have an iPhone. When Apple comes to us and they create the iPhone 2, iPhone 3, iPhone 4, iPhone 4S, iPhone 5C, 5S, and so on and so forth, and you and I buy it and buy it and buy it, and the next one that comes out we buy it. There's a reason why we do that. Because these companies, when they market to us, mind you, Apple doesn't come to you and say, we've got a phone which this much retina display, which this type of camera, which this type of new device, and it costs $700, we'd like you to buy it. No. They come to us saying Apple has got a vision to change the world. The why. How are we going to do it? Well, we've made a new phone for you to use. What does the phone have? The phone has got A, B, C, and D as qualities and characteristics. Here's why you should buy it. It's a very smart movement where now you're not starting by giving people a product, but you're telling them why they need this product. Sadly, we have Islam, but we haven't explained to our children why they do what they do. Or if we do explain it to them, we explain it to them in the most feeble-minded of ways. I'll give you a brief example. There's a young girl who came up to me about 2 weeks ago crying. I said to her, what's wrong? She says, brother, I don't wear hijab. Very young. I said, okay, why are you crying? She says, well, other girls are coming to me and telling me that if I don't wear hijab, God's going to pull me by my hair and hang me on the day of judgment. And I bet you those are the same children whose parents have confined them within a system of haram, halal, and not really understanding what the vision of life is meant to be. Life is much more than a set of laws and regulations set to us by a book. It's life. It's going out and understanding our reality. It's thinking for ourselves. It's having the ability to think logically. That's why Rasulullah was so successful. Why? Because he never set people on a thinking streak. He never sat with Ammar and told him, Ammar, I want you to think this way. Haram, halal, haram, halal. He said, no. He said, Ammar, any person who's being hurt, help him. Ammar, anytime you see injustice, help that individual. Ammar, don't make judgments about the enemies. Let's be kinder to them than they are with us. There were such basic human movements that it liberated the mind. Unfortunately, the mind of the Muslim today is not liberated. We are bound within our religious practices, so to speak, and we're not liberated to think for ourselves. Now, how do we balance this with the system that we have? How do we allow ourselves to balance it? The best way is that, yes, there are a system of laws which we follow. But let's take the next step and ask, is what I follow making sense to me? And if something does not make sense, be human enough to say that this might not make sense to me. There has to be some sort of deeper reality. Because at times we have specific superstitions that if a higher person is telling me this, or if a person with a long beard is telling me this, it must be true. And that's just not the case. Let me give a brief example. There was a story of Harun al-Rashid, where he was sitting with one of his friends and he was saying to him, you know, it's interesting that today smart people have a very distinct look. You're sitting here, what do you mean? He says, well, you know, you can tell a guy's religious by the clothes he wears and, you know, the beard that he has and the way that he's dressed. You could tell he's religious. So the guy sitting next to him said to him, let's test that theory out and see how right you are. He said, okay. The next man that walked by with a long beard and traditional clothing came and he sat him down. He said to him, look, you seem like a very smart man, I've got a question for you. He said, yeah, go ahead and ask me. He said, give me your first name. He gave him his last name. First stupid mistake. He said, give me your last name. He gave him his first name. Then he asked him, he said, look, I've got a fiqh question for you. I've got a question in fiqh which I want you to answer for me. He says, go ahead. He says to him, if a man buys a sheep There's a buyer and a seller. The buyer buys the sheep from the seller and takes it home. And the sheep vomits on the buyer's eye, and the buyer is now hurt because of the vomit. Who should pay the fidya money? Who should pay the money of recompense? The buyer or the seller? Ideally, the answer is either the buyer or the seller. This man looks at Harun and he says to him, you know what? It's the seller's fault. He says, why? He says, because he should have told the buyer that there's a catapult inside of the sheep's stomach that is going to launch something out, not realizing there's a problem with the sheep itself. It just comes to show us that at times we take things for granted, that if a person is dressed in the latest clothes or fashion, he must not be religious and we can't listen to him. But if a person is dressed in a specific way, then this person must be religious and we should take all the laws from him. Ideally, we have scholars in our societies, and God bless and lengthen the lives of our maraja for giving us the years of excessive knowledge and research that they have. But a marja will tell you there are things you cannot even follow me on when it comes to religious theology. You can never follow a marja on that. You can never follow him on those laws. A marja is meant for us to follow, where we follow him on jurisprudential laws. But when it comes to theology, to tawheed, to nubuwah, to imamah, to adala, we're not meant to follow them on these issues, and they tell us that. They tell us that. That's why the Quran comes forward in quite a profound reality. Whenever you examine the stories of prophets which are in the Quran, they're typically stories where a prophet goes through an experience and changes himself. How many of us sitting here are true with our humanity to say that there are some of us who might have prayed Salah for the past 50, 60, 40, 30 years, however much you've prayed. Out of those salats or namaz that we have, take a prime example. Which salah have I left and said to myself, man, I am now a changed human being? How many of those salahs do we have? Is salah meant to do that for me? Because I remember as a youth, many people would come and point the finger to me and say, have you prayed? I would say, no, I haven't prayed. They said, well, you're not a good Muslim. Prayer is mandatory, but there's a reason why it's mandatory. It's not that the mechanical actions make you who you are. But Imam Khomeini comes with a profound statement, and he says, Salah begins once it ends. Is that a riddle? Salah begins once it ends. What are you trying to say? He's saying that the actual Salah, the whole definition of Salah, is much greater than mechanical movements that you do 5 times a day for 70 or 80 years in your life. It's much greater than that. And if you think your human reality can be encompassed in up and down movements daily, then you're completely wrong. How many times have you and I been through an experience where a person might go through a divorce, or a problem with a friend, or a fall in his life, or a disease, or hardship, which changes him and makes him cry and changes him as a person? These hardships change us. But if I was to ask us, how many times have we prayed and gotten up and started crying and said, you know what, I'm going to change my whole life? It happens at times, but it's rare to individuals. But what Salah is meant to do is it's meant to be a template. That's why Imam says it's not about how many times you go up and down in a day. That teaches you discipline to do that. But Islam and your reality and life is much deeper than that. There's so much more depth than that, you cannot confine it. But sadly what we do is that we confine it, we bring it in. Imam Ali alayhi salam, it always amazes me the amount of balance that he struck in his life. When it comes to being the lion of Allah on the battlefield, living life to its fullest, understanding its capacity, understanding what life is about, helping the poor to such an extent. One day a man comes up to Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, he says to him, Imam al-Hasan, he says to him, can you give me a piece of bread? He says, why? Is it for yourself? He says, no, it's not for me. But I saw a poor man who was sitting next to the mosque trying to break a piece of bread with his knee and he couldn't. Imam Hassan says to him, that man is my father, Ali ibn Abi Talib. That man is my father, Amir al-Mu'mineen. A man who understood the reality of life, spoke kindly to even the smallest child, raised the individuals in his society without being judgmental, taking a community and telling them whatever help you may need, I'm here to help you. But at the same time, in the darkness of the night, he would sit alone and his beard would be drenched from his tears. The same individual. There's a balance struck in his life. He's not mechanical where this is all he's doing. He is a human being who's got a realistic vision to what life is about. That's why he could care less the type of clothes that he wore. He could care less how much money he was making. What was important to him is his own human growth. And that's the beauty of his life. A lot of the times we think that what makes us great is when I see a person sitting or reciting dua or praying. It's a great thing to do, but that does not make a great person. Prime example is the Messenger of Allah ﷺ was once walking inside of a masjid, and he sees a man sitting and praying all day long, and he looks at companions and says to him, "Who is this man?" They say to him, "Ya Rasulullah, he's a great man who's one of our companions." He says to him, "Where's his family?" He says, "They're at home." He says, "Who takes care of his family?" He says, "His brother." He says, "His brother is greater than him. Because at least he's interacting with society and coming out and doing something other than being stuck within his own cocoon of what he thinks religion is." That's why in Islam, monkery is not allowed. Islam promotes going out, understanding life, being part of the university environment, being part of and speaking to other religions, having interfaith dialogue. That's what our religion was based upon. But we've made it so stagnant into a system of haram and halal. Let me conclude by saying that the movement of Imam Hussein alayhi salam is, in my opinion, as much as it's a powerful movement, it's an extremely creative movement. Imam didn't sit there and say, "Well, let me flip through the books and see what my grandfather Rasulullah would have wanted me to do. Let me sit there and wait for revelation to come down from the sky." He said, "No, there is injustice happening towards human beings. I don't care who's going to help me. I don't care where it is. I don't care towards whom I have to stand up and do something. It doesn't matter whether Yazid was Muslim, Christian. It does not matter." Imam's movement, in essence, is a human movement. Now, I always ask this question, and it's interesting to see the crowd's reaction. What would we do? How would we react? And how many of us are open-hearted enough to accept that what if we found out somehow in history that the same Hussein ibn Ali who fought in Karbala, who lost his children, who lost his life, who sacrificed everything he had, was not Muslim? Would we still accept him the same way that we look at him now? Would we still accept him? Would we not accept him? Would we accept him? What I'm trying to say is, are we following a banner of Hussein ibn Ali? Are we following a banner of Islam that Hussein ibn Ali had? Or are we following the values that Hussein ibn Ali lived by? Is it the banner that attracts us? Or is it something deeper than the banner? That it doesn't matter what religion Yazid was. There was no religion. He didn't even believe in religion, for goodness sakes. That's Imam Hussein alayhi salam in Karbala. Quite beautifully he articulates this. When he leaves, when he's leaving Mecca, he says that I haven't come out for power nor for greed. What I've come out for is to put forth and strengthen the values and the core principles that my messenger Rasulullah, that my grandfather Rasulullah had come for. That's his mission. That he was willing to go so far for this mission that even if later he died, and that later his clothes were stripped, that later his body was laying on the grounds of Karbala for 3 days in the hot sun, he could care less, because he died a happy individual, a human being who was standing up for another person's rights. That's a powerful movement. And it breaks my heart to say that on those nights, after Imam had died, his sister Zainab comes by his body and she sits by that blessed body. And she starts rubbing the blood off of his body. And she sits there and says to him that, "Brother Hussein, even if I stayed with you, even if the lions and the animals of the desert were to eat me, then I would still sit next to you and never leave your side." That's when Shimr comes to her and strikes her with the end of the spear. And he says to her, "Get up, O daughter of Ali ibn Abi Talib." And he curses Amir al-Mu'mineen. He curses Imam Hussein alayhi salam. That's the same day when Amer ibn Sa'd comes by the body of Imam Hussein. And Imam Hussein, this is moments before he's beheaded, when Shimr sits on his body and beheads Abu Abdullah. Lady Zainab alayhi salam looks at Umar ibn Sa'd and she sees him crying and turning his face away from Imam Hussein, and she says to him, "Oh Umar, will you stand there and do nothing while Abu Abdullah is being killed?" That on that day, when they were taken away from the bodies, one lady left her young child This is the mother of Abdullah al-Saghir, of Ali Asghar. And she looks at the caravan leader and she says to him, "Oh caravan leader, take me back to my young son Ali. I would like to see him once more before I leave." All the family members bid farewell to the bodies. The mother of Ali al-Akbar bid farewell to her son. The mother of Ali al-Asghar bid farewell to her son. Lady Zainab bid farewell to her young sons. And Aba Abdullah, Imam Zain al-Abidin, was the only man left with the woman. Lady Zainab alayhi salam was going to throw herself over the camel on top of the body of Aba Abdullah. Imam Zain al-Abidin says to her aunt Zainab, "If you come down now, who will put you back onto the camel?" As they were approaching Medina, as they were approaching the city, Imam Zain al-Abidin looks at one of his companions and he says to him, "Ya Bishr, your father was a great poet. Go into Medina and tell the people that we have now arrived once again back into the city." Bishr goes inside the city and recites the famous Arabic lines saying, "Ya ala Yathrib la muqama lakum biha, قتل الحسين فأدمعي مدرار الجسم منه بكربلاء مخضب." He says to them, "O people of Medina, there is no room for you here today. Hussein ibn Ali has been killed. His head is on a spear and his body is in Karbala." The first lady who greets Lady Zainab and Imam Zain al-Abidin is al-Baneen, the mother of al-Abbas alayhi salam. al-Baneen has a small child on her shoulder. She comes to Bishr. She says to him, "Ya Bishr, what's this news that you're giving me?" He says to her, "Oh al-Baneen, there has been many killings in Karbala." She says to him, "Tell me what happened to my dear Hussein." Now she has 4 children, 3 children she's not asking about. He says to her, "Oh al-Baneen, may Allah give you a remainder of life. Your son Uthman has been killed." She says to him, "Tell me, what about Hussein?" He says to her, "Ya al-Baneen, your son Abdullah has been killed." She says to him, "Tell me about Hussein." He says to her, "Ya al-Baneen, Abbas has been killed." Narrations tell us that the child which was on her shoulder came and fell from her arm, and she almost fell to the ground. He says to her, "Ya al-Baneen, may Allah give you a longer life. Aba Abdullah has been killed in Karbala." Later, al-Baneen would make 4 graves in Baqi, and she would sit there and she would cry and say that before today I had 4 children, and today I have no children left. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا على محمد أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين يا الله. Let's raise our hands or do a dua, inshallah. Before I conclude, I'd like to thank the Astaana-e-Zehra committee for having me. It's been a great pleasure. They've been extremely hospitable. Thank you so much for hosting me and having me. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعا ويكشف السوء. 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 All together. أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعا ويكشف السوء. Oh Allah, heal all of our sick ones, Ya Allah. Keep us on the path of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad, Ya Allah. Make us leaders in our communities, Ya Allah. أرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. نقرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة تسبقها صلوات.